Open up the door, it's Dave!
Who?
Dave! D-A-V-E!
Dave?
Right, man, Dave.
Dave's not here!
This past weekend, my son graduated from graduate school up at the University of Florida up in Gainesville. Gainesville is about 325 miles-ish from where I live. So we took the trip up and we went to see his graduation and helped get him on his way to his job and whatever other things needed to happen just to get him moved out of his place. So I wanted to tell the story about the road trip up to Gainesville. One side note here is that we were originally intending to drive all the way to Gainesville, but it turned out that since this was graduation weekend and there's a lot of students graduating, hotel rooms were hard to come by. So we actually stayed in Ocala, which is about 35, maybe 40 miles south of Gainesville, and then drove back and forth to make the day's work for us. So we actually used the superchargers along the way to kind of get a feel for it. Now, another thing I wanted to point out is in the Tesla app, there is now a way to do some route planning before you even get in the car. There are other ways to do it, of course, but in the app itself, you can put in some information and talk about where you want to go, and it'll help plan the route and get to the superchargers. Now, something I noticed when I did this, you can put in your starting destination, your ending destination, and the battery percentage you want to use when you depart, but using it isn't exactly accurate. It doesn't really draw enough data from the car to come up with the same conclusions, but it's similar to what you get there. And then, of course, when you go to the car, you can put the information in and have the car route you exactly, and it will tell you where to charge. Now, I wanted to spend a minute and talk about the range on the car. The range is set to 330 miles with the battery that I have in my car. But that does not mean that I get 330 miles on a charge. In fact, that's the optimal, ideal conditions getting me to somewhere, and I could get as much as 330 miles on a charge. There are many factors that contribute to how many miles you get on a single charge, not the least of which is the weight in the car, the heat or the cold outside, the driving conditions, whether you're going up and down hills. There are other factors about how much you're going to use regenerative braking so you can get a little more in there, how fast you're going, and many other factors. So you have to consider that there's many things that contribute to the range. Now, I can probably get on a good day, I should be able to get somewhere close to 300 miles on a charge. But remember that Tesla is always maintaining about 10% in reserve just in case. So I will see that sometimes the mileage will be about 270, 280 miles to reserve that 10% and still keep me in the range of about 300 miles. So I can realistically go about 280 miles or so on a single charge, even though it's 330 miles rated as a charge on the battery. A couple of quick caveats before I get to actually talking about the charging destinations. One is that several of the destinations were high usage, so they would only charge to 80%, which is a limiting factor to a point. Then also on the way home, I noticed that as I was driving along, the percentage seemed to change as I did different things of what I'd return home with. So it started off at like 13% when I first got my first charge, it went to 20% when I stopped at one point, and then when I got home, it was about 15% when I actually pulled up to my door. I show here on the screen all the charging stops I made, and what I wanted to point out was I was able to go about 180, 200 miles before I went to a charging stop and then continued to charge. I went to Ocala, then up to Gainesville, then back to Ocala, then up to Gainesville, and all the way back down to South Florida. So it was pretty straightforward in that sense, and it kept telling me where to stop. But it definitely was a little bit time consuming every time I had to stop and actually sit there and take a charge. So it was one factor I had to consider in the whole thing. Overall, it was pretty easy and straightforward, but I just wanted you to understand sort of the big picture of how many stops I made. That when I went to the supercharger in Gainesville, I noticed there was a tow truck towing a Tesla heading over to the supercharger. And I've never seen this happen before. But he pulled into the space where there was a charging spot and dropped the car off there so the person could start charging their car right there. I didn't bother to talk to the guy. He looked a little embarrassed about the whole thing anyway, so I just let it go. But I assumed that maybe he left it at home and forgot to charge it, or something else happened and didn't charge it. But it was a weird thing. I've never seen that happen before, with somebody towing a Tesla to a supercharger to get a charge. Very unusual. So I was here at this supercharger up along the end of the turnpike in Florida. And I'm sitting in my car and I just started charging, and somebody walked over to the car. It was at the next supercharger over. And he says, can you help me for a second? I can't get my car to start charging. So he rented his Tesla from Hertz or whatever, and he's got it there and he couldn't get it to start, and he was wondering why. So I walked over to it and I was like, well, let's see what we can do. And I was like, sometimes, the things don't work. Usually that's reported. It's not a big deal. It didn't say it wasn't working, so let's see. So I tried tugging on the cable a little bit, and was trying to take it out, and I couldn't pull the cable out, saying it was charge port was open, but it was unable to charge. So I tugged the cord a couple of times, pushed it, pulled it, and then finally was able to pull it out. And it looks like it just didn't seat quite properly, and when it didn't seat properly, it wouldn't start charging. So I took it out, let the door close, reopened the door, and then just plugged it back in, and it started charging. So it was just a contact thing. It just hadn't made complete contact with it. And so I was explaining to them, sometimes that happens. Like, wow, he was really impressed with the Tesla. He'd never driven one before, but he rented one, and they showed him how to use it, basically, and he was able to get off and running pretty quickly, and he was very excited about it. He and his wife were really enjoying their ride in it. And I thought that was pretty cool, and I was able to help somebody out, and I always find that kind of compelling in its own way when I help somebody and get them started. So just wanted to share the little story there of stopping at a supercharger and someone needed a little help, which does happen sometimes. Overall, what was my thought about the entirety of this road trip? It's the first time I've taken my wife with me on a longer road trip like this. So the thing is that the superchargers themselves, they're convenient, they're well located, they're well situated, you can find them easily, they're easy to get in and out of, no problem there, and they really don't take very long to charge. But some of these were a little slower. Even though some of them said they were 150 kilowatt hours or even greater, some of them charged very slowly. And that was a bit of an issue along the way, where it took longer to charge and we had to sit for longer a couple of times than I wanted to. Now, in one supercharger, when we were in Ocala, I actually took the time to clean the bugs off the front of the car and actually off the hood and whatever. So that was convenient in that sense, but having to stop and charge several times while we were away, and it was sort of inconvenient in the way that we had to stay and sit there for a while and charge. And I have to say that while my wife was appreciative of the fact that it cost less than taking the internal combustion engine car, the fact that it actually took longer and it was more about the journey was maybe mildly annoying to her. Now, granted, this car is more comfortable than the Model 3, so she was definitely more comfortable and was okay with taking it on a longer road trip, but I don't know that she'd want to go on an even longer road trip than that. I think that's probably about her upper limit. It was 330 miles each way, plus some time in between, so we spent a total of 750 miles in the car. And that was fine as far as that goes. If the charging stations actually charged at a higher rate, or the charge stops were shorter, it probably would have been no problem at all. But 330 miles is about the limit on what you want the battery to be at. If you have a larger battery, that would be terrific. Smaller battery just won't work for these kinds of longer road trips. It's useful, but it's not that great. Now, the other thing is to keep in mind that the car itself had plenty of room in it. And let me just break down the total cost for you and the time I spent charging. Now, the total charging time across those 6 stops over the course of 2 days was 140 minutes, about 2 hours, and it was about $70. So that's about 8 cents per mile to run the car. Now, if I compare that to the internal combustion engine that was getting about 27.5 miles per gallon at about 350 per gallon, it would have cost almost $100 and 2 fill-ups. So just consider that.
What's your point, David?